What if some of the most dangerous people in history were not murderers, conquerors, or tyrants, but people who simply told the truth? Think about that for a moment. Throughout history, empires have survived wars, plagues, invasions, and economic collapse. Kings have faced rebellions. Religions have faced challenges. Entire civilizations have endured unimaginable suffering. Yet again and again, one thing frightened those in power more than armies, more than weapons, and sometimes even more than death itself: the truth. Not because truth is powerful on its own, but because truth has a strange ability to destroy illusions, and every society is built on some form of illusion. The illusion that leaders are always right. The illusion that traditions must never be questioned. The illusion that the world is exactly as we have been told it is. Most people live comfortably inside these illusions. They provide certainty. They provide identity. They provide order. But every so often someone appears who asks a dangerous question. A philosopher, a scientist, a writer, a teacher, a rebel, a witness. Someone who looks at the world and says, "What if we've been wrong?" And from that moment on, history often turns against them. They are called traitors, heretics, madmen, enemies of the people, threats to stability, not because they are lying, but because they are forcing others to confront uncomfortable realities. The tragedy of history is that societies rarely recognize truth when they first hear it. Instead, they punish it, they laugh at it, they censor it, they imprison it, and sometimes they kill it. At least they try to, because there is something remarkable about truth. Unlike armies, it cannot be defeated in battle. Unlike books, it cannot be completely burned. Unlike people, it cannot truly be executed. A person can disappear. An idea can wait. And the truth can survive for centuries in silence before returning stronger than ever. History is filled with stories of individuals who paid an unimaginable price for speaking honestly. Some lost their careers, some lost their families, some lost their freedom, some lost their lives. Yet many of the things they said would later become accepted as obvious facts. The same societies that condemned them eventually celebrated them. The same governments that silenced them later built monuments to them. The same people who feared them eventually taught their words to children. And that raises a disturbing question. If we had lived in their time, would we have supported them? Or would we have joined the crowd demanding their silence? It is easy to admire truth-tellers after history has proven them right. It is much harder to stand beside them when everyone else calls them dangerous, because the greatest conflict in history has never been between nations. It has never been between races. It has never been between religions. It has been between comfort and truth, between certainty and doubt, between the stories people want to believe and the reality they desperately try to avoid. Tonight, we will travel across centuries and continents to meet the men and women who dared to challenge accepted reality, people who refused to stay silent, people who paid for honesty with suffering, people who lost everything and yet changed the world. These are the stories of those who spoke the truth and the history that tried to destroy them. The world before truth. Before we can understand why truth-tellers were punished, we must first understand something uncomfortable about human nature. Human beings do not simply seek truth, they seek security. For thousands of years, survival depended not on being right, but on belonging. In the ancient world, being rejected by your tribe could mean starvation. Being expelled from your city could mean death. Being labeled an enemy could destroy everything. As a result, humans evolved to value social acceptance almost as much as physical survival. This created a powerful psychological force. People often prefer a comfortable lie over a painful truth, not because they are stupid, not because they are evil, but because truth can be frightening. Truth can force people to abandon beliefs they have held their entire lives. Truth can threaten power structures. Truth can expose corruption. Truth can destroy identities. And when that happens, societies frequently react with hostility. Ancient civilizations were built upon stories. Stories about gods, stories about kings, stories about destiny, stories about why society existed. These stories created unity. They provided meaning. They explained suffering. They gave people a sense of order in a chaotic world. But stories have a weakness. The moment someone questions them, cracks begin to appear, and those who benefit from the story often become its strongest defenders. Throughout history, rulers understood this reality very well. An army could conquer a city, but an idea could conquer an empire. A sword could kill a man, but a dangerous truth could outlive generations. This is why so many governments, religious authorities, and powerful institutions feared certain individuals more than entire armies. Those individuals possessed something rare. They were willing to say what others were afraid to say, and that willingness made them dangerous. Not dangerous because they carried weapons, dangerous because they carried questions. Questions have always been the beginning of revolutions. The moment a person asks, why? How do we know this is true? Who benefits from this belief? The foundations of certainty begin to shake. History repeatedly shows that societies often celebrate obedience, but fear independent thought. The obedient citizen maintains order. The questioning citizen creates uncertainty, and uncertainty terrifies those who hold power. This pattern can be found in ancient Athens, in imperial Rome, in medieval kingdoms, in religious institutions, in modern governments. Across different cultures, languages, and centuries, the reaction remains surprisingly similar. When truth threatens power, power often fights back, sometimes with ridicule, sometimes with censorship, sometimes with prisons, and sometimes with death. Yet despite all these efforts, truth has a remarkable habit of surviving. Because while lies require protection, truth can endure on its own. And throughout history, there have always been individuals willing to sacrifice everything to defend it. The first of these famous truth-tellers emerged more than 2,000 years ago in a city that believed itself to be the center of civilization. His name was Socrates, and his story would become one of the most famous examples of a society destroying a man simply for asking questions. History rarely collapses the way people expect. There is no single trumpet blast that announces the beginning of the end. No universal moment when societies suddenly realize that the ground beneath them has already started to shift. More often, the most dangerous phase in the life of any civilization arrives quietly, wrapped not in panic, but in comfort. Across centuries and continents, the pattern repeats with almost unsettling consistency. Systems do not usually fail when they look fragile. They fail when they still look strong, when the markets still function, when the borders still appear secure, when daily life still feels normal. Ancient Rome did not wake up one morning to discover it was weak. In the 2nd century, at the height of what historians later called the Pax Romana, the empire appeared nearly untouchable. Roads stretched across continents, legions guarded distant frontiers, cities pulsed with trade, law, and imperial confidence. To the average Roman citizen, the system did not feel like it was approaching danger. It felt permanent. And that feeling, the quiet psychological shift from vigilance to comfort, has proven again and again to be one of the most expensive illusions in history. Human beings are not naturally built to live in constant alert. When a system delivers stability long enough, the mind begins to economize attention. Threat signals that once triggered urgency start to feel distant. Warnings begin to sound exaggerated. Small fractures are reinterpreted as temporary noise. This is not stupidity, it is cognitive efficiency. And under the right conditions, it becomes extremely dangerous, because complex systems rarely collapse from a single blow. They weaken through accumulation, demographic strain, economic pressure, institutional rigidity. External shocks that would have been manageable in a more flexible phase of the system begin to overlap. And when that overlap happens inside a culture that has already grown psychologically comfortable, reaction time slows at exactly the moment when speed matters most. The Romans experienced this. So did late imperial China. So did early modern monarchies in Europe. So did more recent political and economic systems that, not long before their moment of crisis, were widely described as stable, mature, and fundamentally secure. What makes this pattern so persistent is not simply structural, it is psychological. Again and again, human societies generate what might be called comfort narratives, quiet internal stories that reduce anxiety in the short term but increase vulnerability over time. We still have time. It cannot happen here. The system is strong. Someone else will fix it. These are not merely political miscalculations. They are emotional stabilizers. They help populations sleep at night. They help leaders avoid premature panic. And in many periods of history, they even work, right up until the moment they don't. This is the paradox at the heart of long-lived civilizations. The very stability that makes a system successful in one century can quietly prepare the psychological conditions for delayed reaction in the next. The longer a structure survives, the more normal it begins to feel. The more normal it feels, the less urgent emerging risks appear. And the less urgent the risks appear, the harder it becomes to mobilize meaningful adaptation before pressure reaches a critical threshold. This is not a story about one empire. It is not a story about one moment of failure. It is a recurring human pattern that crosses geography, culture, and time. In this video, we are going to examine the most dangerous comfort lies in history, the quiet assumptions that have repeatedly convinced intelligent societies that everything was still under control, right before it wasn't. Because the most important question is not why systems collapse in moments of obvious chaos. History answers that question quite clearly. The more unsettling question is why so many systems fail while still appearing stable. And once you begin to see the pattern, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. If history teaches anything consistently, it is that human beings are remarkably skilled at misleading themselves, often without realizing they are doing it. This is not simply a matter of ignorance or lack of intelligence. In many cases, the societies and leaders who fell into dangerous comfort were highly educated, strategically experienced, and fully capable of complex reasoning. The question, then, is not why uninformed people make mistakes. The more unsettling question is why intelligent individuals and advanced civilizations repeatedly construct narratives that soften reality at the very moment clarity is most needed. The answer begins deep inside the architecture of the human mind. The brain is not designed primarily to perceive reality with perfect accuracy. It is designed to maintain functional stability under uncertainty. From an evolutionary perspective, excessive anxiety is costly. Constant high-alert states drain energy, disrupt coordination, and impair long-term planning. Over thousands of years, the human nervous system evolved subtle mechanisms to reduce psychological overload, even if doing so occasionally meant distorting risk perception. This is where self-deception begins to take shape. When incoming information threatens a person's sense of control or predictability, the mind often engages in quiet cognitive smoothing. Warning signals are reinterpreted as temporary. Negative trends are framed as anomalies. Ambiguous threats are pushed into the category of not yet urgent. Psychologists today refer to several of these mechanisms by name: normalcy bias, optimism bias, cognitive dissonance reduction. But the pattern itself is ancient. Roman elites displayed it when frontier pressures began to mount. Late imperial courts displayed it when administrative strain accumulated. Financial systems have displayed it repeatedly in the years leading up to major economic shocks. The pattern is not random, it is protective, at least in the short term. Self-deception reduces immediate stress. It preserves social cohesion. It prevents premature panic. In stable environments, these traits can even be adaptive. But under conditions of slow structural change, the same mental efficiencies become liabilities. Because the human mind is particularly poor at intuitively grasping gradual risk accumulation, sudden danger triggers fast response. Slow drift often triggers rationalization. Marcus Aurelius himself seemed acutely aware of this vulnerability. Again and again in Meditations, he warns himself not to accept comforting interpretations too quickly, not to assume that emotional relief equals clarity, not to mistake temporary calm for structural security. What he was fighting internally was not simply fear or frustration. It was the far more subtle human tendency to prefer reassuring stories over uncomfortable probabilities, and this tendency scales. What begins as individual cognitive smoothing can, under the right conditions, become collective narrative. When enough people inside a system share the same comfort assumptions, the result is cultural inertia. Signals that might otherwise trigger adaptation are collectively downgraded. Response windows narrow. By the time reality becomes undeniable, the cost of adjustment has often multiplied. This is why self-deception in history is rarely loud or theatrical. It is quiet, reasonable, often supported by selective evidence that makes the comforting interpretation feel justified, at least for a while. Human beings do not usually lie to themselves because they are careless. They do it because the alternative, sustained uncertainty and continuous vigilance, is psychologically expensive. And yet, as history repeatedly demonstrates, the short-term relief purchased by self-deception often carries a much larger long-term cost. Beneath the surface of every long-lived civilization, there operates a quiet psychological system that rarely draws attention to itself: the human need for emotional equilibrium. This need is so deeply embedded in the structure of the mind that most people mistake it for clear thinking. In reality, it often functions as something far more subtle, a built-in mechanism that protects the individual, and sometimes the entire society, from the full emotional weight of uncertainty. The human brain is not optimized for permanent high alert. Sustained vigilance is metabolically expensive, cognitively draining, and socially destabilizing if maintained for too long. As a result, the mind developed what we might call psychological comfort regulators, internal processes that gently lower perceived threat levels when stress remains prolonged but not immediately catastrophic. One of the most powerful of these regulators is normalization. When a warning signal appears repeatedly without immediate disaster following it, the nervous system begins to downgrade its urgency. What initially feels alarming slowly becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar begins, over time, to feel safe. This is not conscious denial, it is adaptive smoothing. In stable periods of history, this mechanism helps populations function without constant panic. Markets continue operating, cities continue trading, governments continue administrating. But under conditions of slow structural strain, the same mechanism can quietly distort risk perception at scale. Another layer of psychological comfort comes from narrative coherence. Human beings have a strong internal drive to maintain a story in which the world remains broadly understandable and manageable. When incoming evidence threatens that story, When cracks appear in systems that were assumed to be stable, the mind often engages in subtle reinterpretation rather than immediate revision. Ambiguous data is softened. Contradictory signals are compartmentalized. Short-term stability is used to justify long-term confidence. This is why historical actors so often appear in retrospect to have missed obvious signs. From the inside of the moment, the signs rarely feel obvious. They feel gradual, mixed, and open to multiple interpretations. And the psychological comfort system strongly favors the interpretation that preserves emotional equilibrium. There is also a social dimension to this mechanism that makes it even more powerful. Humans regulate not only individually, but collectively. When most people in a system appear calm, the perceived need for alarm drops even further. Concern begins to feel socially costly. Caution begins to look like overreaction, and the collective emotional baseline settles into a deceptively stable calm. Marcus Aurelius seemed unusually sensitive to this human tendency. His repeated self-warnings not to drift into complacency, not to trust emotional relief too quickly, not to assume that present calm guaranteed future stability, read almost like a personal attempt to resist the very comfort mechanisms that come so naturally to the human mind. But even for a Stoic emperor, this resistance required constant effort, because the psychological comfort system is not a flaw in human design. It is a feature, one that works extremely well in environments where threats are sudden and obvious. It becomes dangerous only in complex systems, where risk accumulates slowly, quietly, and just below the threshold that normally triggers alarm. And that is precisely the environment in which many of history's most consequential miscalculations have occurred. Few phrases in human history have been more quietly dangerous than the simple internal reassurance, "There is no real danger yet." It rarely appears in official declarations. It is almost never spoken with arrogance. Instead, it emerges gradually as a feeling, a shared assumption, a subtle emotional consensus that the system still has margin left. This is the illusion of safety, and it has accompanied more declining civilizations than open panic ever has. The mechanism behind this illusion is deeply human. When threats arrive slowly, unevenly, and without immediate catastrophic consequences, the mind begins to recalibrate its baseline of concern. Each uneventful day becomes silent evidence that the situation, while perhaps imperfect, remains fundamentally manageable. Each avoided disaster reinforces the emotional conclusion that the warnings may have been exaggerated. Over time, the absence of immediate collapse begins to feel like proof of long-term security. Ancient Rome experienced this repeatedly. Frontier pressures along the Rhine and Danube did not begin as overwhelming invasions. They began as manageable disturbances, incursions that the imperial system at first successfully contained. But success in early containment created psychological side effects. Because when a system survives the first wave of stress, its leaders and population often update their internal model of risk in the wrong direction. Instead of interpreting survival as a temporary success, requiring continued vigilance, the mind quietly interprets it as confirmation that the underlying structure is stronger than critics suggested. The same pattern appeared in late imperial courts in China, in European monarchies facing early fiscal strain, and in modern institutional crises that, in their early stages, looked entirely manageable. What makes the illusion of no danger yet so persistent is that it is rarely built on pure fantasy. It is usually supported by real short-term stability. Markets may still function, armies may still hold the frontier, administrative systems may still produce results that look, on the surface, reassuring. The danger lies not in immediate falsehood, but in extrapolation. Human beings are remarkably prone to projecting present stability forward in time, especially when acknowledging vulnerability would require costly or disruptive change. Psychologically, the illusion serves an important short-term function. It preserves social calm. It prevents premature overreaction. It allows complex systems to continue operating without constant crisis mode. But when structural pressures continue to accumulate beneath that calm surface, the same stabilizing belief begins to delay necessary adaptation. Marcus Aurelius appears to have been unusually aware of this cognitive trap. His repeated reminders to himself to expect difficulty, to remain alert even in periods of apparent calm, to distrust the comforting voice that says the present moment defines the future, suggest a ruler actively trying to resist the gravitational pull of premature reassurance. Yet history shows how powerful the illusion can become once it spreads collectively. When enough actors inside a system internalize the belief that there is still time, still buffer, still margin for error, the window for effective response begins to narrow almost invisibly. By the time the danger becomes emotionally undeniable, the structural flexibility required to respond quickly is often already diminished. This is why the most consequential moments in the life of complex systems rarely feel dramatic when they are unfolding. They feel normal, manageable, temporarily under control. And it is precisely in that deceptively calm phase when the phrase, "there is no real danger yet," feels most reasonable, that the long-term trajectory of a civilization can begin to shift in ways that are very difficult to reverse. When historians look back at the later centuries of Roman power, one pattern appears with uncomfortable clarity. Rome was rarely defeated because it failed to see problems at all. Far more often, it recognized emerging pressures, but reacted to them slowly, cautiously, and sometimes fatally late. This was not because Roman leadership lacked intelligence. The empire possessed one of the most sophisticated administrative and military systems the ancient world had ever produced. Its frontier reports were detailed. Its logistical networks were vast. Its political class was experienced in managing complex threats. The danger emerged from something more subtle, the psychological and institutional inertia that develops inside long, successful systems. By the 2nd century, Rome had enjoyed generations of relative strategic dominance. Frontier disturbances along the Rhine and Danube had been contained repeatedly. Provincial revolts, when they occurred, were usually suppressed with overwhelming force. Over time, this pattern of successful containment began to shape expectations inside the imperial mindset. Pressure at the edges of the empire did not immediately register as existential risk. It registered as manageable noise, something the Roman machine had handled before and would likely handle again. But conditions along the northern frontier were slowly changing. Germanic confederations were becoming more coordinated. Population pressures beyond Rome's borders were increasing migratory movement. The empire's own demographic and military buffers, especially after the Antonine Plague, were thinning in ways that were not always immediately visible in annual reports. None of these developments looked catastrophic in isolation. That was precisely the problem. Each individual signal remained within the range of what Roman administrators considered normal frontier volatility, and when threats remain within familiar ranges, large systems often default to familiar responses. Rome reinforced borders. It negotiated with tribal leaders. It launched punitive expeditions when necessary. In the short term, these measures worked often enough to reinforce confidence in the existing playbook. But what the Roman system was slower to recognize was the cumulative shift in scale and frequency. The environment was not repeating itself. It was gradually intensifying. And large, complex bureaucratic systems are notoriously slow to recalibrate when change arrives incrementally rather than dramatically. By the time Marcus Aurelius was forced into the prolonged Marcomannic conflicts, the empire was already operating with narrower margins than earlier generations had enjoyed. Recruitment was more difficult. Population losses from disease had reduced the depth of Rome's human reserves. Frontier pressure required longer, more sustained military presence than the earlier Roman model had been designed to maintain indefinitely. Yet even in this phase, Rome did not collapse. This is what makes the lesson more subtle and more important. Late reaction does not always produce immediate failure. In fact, Rome continued to function for generations after these pressures began to accumulate. But delayed adaptation carries compounding costs. Military expenditures rise, administrative strain increases, strategic flexibility narrows. The system becomes more dependent on strong individual leadership to manage stresses that earlier institutional design would have absorbed more easily. In many ways, Rome's greatest vulnerability was not blindness. It was confidence shaped by centuries of prior success. The empire had learned through repeated experience that most frontier disturbances could be managed without radical structural change. And for a long time, that assessment was broadly correct. Until gradually, it wasn't. The Roman case illustrates a recurring historical danger. When a system has successfully handled a certain category of threat many times before, its internal models of risk become calibrated to the past. But when the environment evolves faster than those models update, response timing begins to lag behind reality. And the most dangerous phase is rarely the first missed signal. It is the period when the system still appears strong enough to compensate, even as the underlying margin for error is quietly shrinking. By the time the Byzantine Empire entered its final centuries, it did not resemble a civilization in immediate free fall. Constantinople still stood behind its massive Theodosian walls, some of the most formidable defensive structures the medieval world had ever seen. The imperial court still functioned. Trade still flowed through the Bosporus. From a distance, the empire retained many of the outward signals of continuity, and that surface continuity became one of the most dangerous psychological cushions in its final phase. Because Byzantium's decline, like Rome's earlier strain, did not begin with sudden military annihilation. It unfolded gradually through fiscal pressure, territorial contraction, internal political fragmentation, and the slow erosion of strategic depth. Yet each stage of contraction was, for a time, survivable. After the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople itself was shockingly captured by Western crusaders, the Byzantine state managed, against considerable odds, to reconstitute itself in 1261. This recovery, while impressive, had an unintended psychological consequence. It reinforced a dangerous historical memory. The empire could endure catastrophic shocks and still return. That lesson would echo quietly in later generations of Byzantine leadership. Over the 14th and early 15th centuries, the empire's territorial footprint shrank dramatically. Ottoman expansion steadily absorbed former Byzantine lands in Anatolia and the Balkans. Revenue streams narrowed. Military manpower declined. The empire increasingly relied on diplomacy, tribute arrangements, and shifting alliances to compensate for its reduced material base. None of this was invisible to Byzantine elites. They understood, at least intellectually, that the balance of power was shifting. But understanding, pressure, and mobilizing sufficiently early adaptation are not the same thing. Constantinople's extraordinary defensive reputation, earned over centuries of successful sieges, created a powerful psychological buffer. The walls had held before. The city had survived earlier crises that seemed, at the time, equally dire. And so the illusion of survivability persisted longer than the underlying strategic reality justified. By the time Sultan Mehmed II began his final preparations in the early 1450s, Byzantium was already operating with extremely thin margins. Its population had declined sharply from earlier imperial centuries. Its treasury was limited. Its capacity to field large independent armies was significantly reduced. Yet daily life inside the capital, while strained, did not necessarily feel apocalyptic until very late in the process. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the Byzantine endgame. Civilizations often do not experience their final phase as a constant emergency. They experience long stretches of uneasy normality punctuated by moments of acute stress, and human psychology is strongly inclined to interpret the return of normal routine after each crisis as evidence that the system still retains deeper resilience. When Mehmed's massive cannons finally began to pound the Theodosian walls in 1453, the underlying structural imbalance had already been building for decades. The final siege was dramatic, but the narrowing of Byzantine strategic options had been gradual, incremental, and, for long periods, psychologically manageable. The fall of Constantinople did not occur because Byzantine leaders were unaware of Ottoman growth. It occurred because the window in which structural adaptation might have significantly altered the balance had slowly, almost imperceptibly, narrowed over generations. Byzantium's final lesson mirrors Rome's in an unsettling way. Long survival breeds powerful expectations of continued survival. Systems that have endured repeated crises often develop deep institutional confidence in their ability to weather the next one. And sometimes that confidence remains emotionally persuasive, right up until the moment when the underlying conditions have changed more than anyone inside the system fully realized. By the time the Ottoman Empire began to seriously confront the need for deep reform, the question was no longer whether change was necessary. The question had quietly shifted to whether meaningful adaptation could still occur fast enough to preserve long-term strategic balance. For centuries, the Ottoman system had been one of the most formidable political and military machines in the early modern world. Its administrative structure was disciplined. Its military organization, especially during the classical period, was highly effective. Its geopolitical position allowed it to project influence across multiple regions simultaneously. Success, however, carries its own long-term psychological consequences. Repeated victory creates institutional confidence. Institutional confidence over time can harden into structural inertia. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the external environment surrounding the Ottoman state was evolving rapidly. European military technology was advancing. Fiscal systems in rival states were becoming more efficient and more scalable. Naval power dynamics were shifting. The Ottomans did not completely fail to notice these changes. Reform discussions appeared periodically at the highest levels of the imperial administration. Military observers were aware of certain tactical gaps. Diplomatic reports increasingly reflected concern about the changing balance of power. But recognition and transformation rarely move at the same speed inside large, tradition-bound systems. One of the Ottoman Empire's greatest strengths, its deeply rooted institutional continuity, also became one of the factors that complicated rapid adaptation. The Janissary Corps, once a cornerstone of Ottoman military dominance, had over generations become socially and politically embedded in ways that made structural reform extremely sensitive. Administrative traditions that had provided long-term stability were not easily reconfigured without risking internal disruption. Reform-minded sultans and statesmen faced a recurring dilemma: move too slowly, and the external gap continues to widen; move too aggressively, and the internal political structure risks destabilization. For long periods, the empire managed this tension through partial adjustments rather than full systemic overhaul. In the short term, this approach often preserved internal order, but it also allowed technological and organizational divergence with European powers to continue accumulating. By the time more serious reform efforts emerged, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries with initiatives like the Nizam-e-Jadid and later the Tanzimat reforms, the strategic environment had already shifted significantly. The empire was no longer adjusting from a position of clear structural advantage. It was attempting to catch up under pressure. This is the critical historical inflection point. Late reform is not the same as no reform. The Ottoman state did adapt in important ways. Administrative modernization occurred. Military restructuring was pursued. Legal and bureaucratic reforms were implemented over time. But adaptation under widening external pressure is always more difficult than proactive evolution during periods of relative strategic comfort. The Ottoman experience illustrates a recurring pattern in long-lived systems. Early success builds powerful institutional habits. Those habits, when the environment begins to shift, can slow the speed at which uncomfortable structural changes are fully embraced. And when reform windows narrow gradually rather than suddenly, the urgency required to overcome internal resistance often arrives later than the external situation ideally allows. By the 19th century, the Ottoman leadership clearly understood the scale of the challenge before them. But by then, the empire was operating in a far more compressed margin of maneuver than it had enjoyed in earlier centuries. The lesson is not that the Ottomans failed to perceive change. It is that adaptation delayed by decades of structural confidence becomes progressively more expensive, more politically difficult, and more constrained by the very institutional weight that once made the system so durable. If the warning signs are often visible, the question becomes unavoidable. Why do human beings delay responding to danger even when the signals are already present? History suggests that this pattern is not primarily about ignorance. In many cases, the individuals and institutions involved were aware, at least partially, that pressures were building. The deeper issue lies in how the human mind processes slow-moving threat. The brain is highly responsive to immediate visible danger. Sudden attack, rapid collapse, or clear physical threat triggers fast mobilization. But gradual risk accumulation activates a very different psychological pathway. When change unfolds slowly, the nervous system repeatedly updates its baseline of what feels normal. Each uneventful day becomes quiet evidence that the situation remains manageable. Each successfully absorbed shock reinforces the belief that existing coping mechanisms are sufficient. Over time, urgency begins to erode, not because the danger has disappeared, but because the mind has adapted emotionally to its presence. Psychologists today describe part of this process as normalcy bias, the tendency to assume that because something has not yet caused catastrophic disruption, it is unlikely to do so soon. But beneath that technical label lies a deeper human instinct, the desire to preserve cognitive and emotional stability for as long as possible. Responding to emerging danger is expensive. It requires reallocating resources, accepting uncertainty, and often confronting politically or socially disruptive change. Delaying action, by contrast, preserves short-term equilibrium. It allows systems to continue functioning without the immediate costs of major adjustment. And in the early stages of many historical crises, delay even appears rational, because in the beginning the system often does continue to function. Rome continued to field armies, Byzantium continued to trade, the Ottoman administration continued to govern vast territories. From the inside of these systems, the environment did not always feel like imminent collapse. It felt strained, but survivable. This is where another powerful mechanism enters the picture: incremental normalization. Humans are remarkably adaptable to gradually worsening conditions. What would have triggered alarm if introduced suddenly can become tolerable if introduced slowly. Each small adjustment in expectations makes the next adjustment easier to absorb, until the cumulative shift becomes far larger than any single step appeared at the time. There is also a social dimension that reinforces delay. Individuals rarely assess systemic risk in isolation. They look to the emotional posture of others. If markets remain calm, if institutions continue operating, if leadership messaging remains measured, the perceived urgency of emerging threats drops even further. Concern begins to feel premature. Caution begins to feel socially costly. And the window for early, relatively inexpensive adaptation begins to narrow quietly in the background. Marcus Aurelius seemed unusually sensitive to this human vulnerability. His repeated reminders to himself to expect disruption, to remain mentally prepared for reversal, to distrust the comforting assumption that present stability guarantees future security, rude almost like a personal attempt to counteract the natural human tendency to drift toward delay. But even for a Stoic emperor, resisting this drift required continuous effort, because postponement is not simply a failure of will. It is a deeply embedded feature of human cognitive design. In stable environments, it helps conserve energy and maintain social cohesion. In slowly destabilizing systems, however, the same mechanism can push critical responses just far enough into the future that, by the time action finally feels urgent, the cost of adaptation has multiplied, and the margin for easy correction has already begun to close. Among the many cognitive patterns that shape human behavior under slow-moving pressure, few are as quietly influential as what modern psychology calls normalcy bias. At its core, normalcy bias is the tendency of individuals and societies to assume that the future will broadly resemble the recent past, especially when no immediate catastrophe has yet occurred. It is not simple denial. It is not even necessarily irrational in the short term. It is a deeply embedded mental shortcut that allows the human nervous system to conserve energy and avoid constant states of alarm. For most of human history, environments that remained stable for extended periods usually did continue to remain stable. The brain learned through repeated experience that yesterday is often a reasonable predictor of tomorrow. And in many everyday situations, this assumption works well enough to keep individuals and societies functioning efficiently. The problem emerges when conditions begin to change gradually beneath the surface. Normalcy bias operates most powerfully in environments where warning signals are present but ambiguous, where pressures are increasing but not yet catastrophic, and where daily life still retains enough routine to feel familiar. Under these conditions, the human mind tends to downgrade early warning signs. Small disruptions are interpreted as temporary anomalies. Unusual events are folded back into the expectation of continuity. Each day that passes without visible collapse becomes emotional reinforcement that the system is still fundamentally sound. History provides repeated examples of this pattern. Late Roman elites observed mounting frontier pressure for decades before it translated into irreversible structural strain. Byzantine leadership watched territorial contraction unfold gradually over generations. Ottoman reformers recognized technological divergence long before full-scale modernization became urgent policy. In each case, the signals were not completely invisible. They were simply processed through a mental framework calibrated by long periods of prior stability. What makes normalcy bias particularly dangerous in complex civilizations is its interaction with institutional scale. Large systems are designed to absorb shocks. When they successfully absorb early disturbances, they unintentionally reinforce the belief that deeper resilience remains intact. This creates a feedback loop. Early survival reduces perceived urgency. Reduced urgency delays adaptation. Delayed adaptation allows underlying pressures to accumulate further. By the time the situation becomes emotionally undeniable, the structural flexibility that once made adjustment relatively easy may already be significantly reduced. Marcus Aurelius appears to have had an unusually intuitive grasp of this human tendency. His repeated warnings to himself, not to assume that present calm guarantees future security, not to mistake temporary stability for permanent order, read almost like a deliberate effort to counteract the pull of normalcy bias within his own thinking. But even disciplined awareness does not eliminate the bias entirely. Because normalcy bias is not merely a mistake in reasoning, it is a protective feature of the human cognitive system, one that works extremely well in environments where change is sudden and obvious. It becomes hazardous only in the kind of slow, compounding pressure environments that have preceded many of history's most consequential turning points. And that is precisely why the most dangerous phase in the life of complex systems so often feels, from the inside, deceptively ordinary. By the later centuries of the Roman Empire, the governing elite did not suddenly become incompetent, nor did they entirely lose access to information about the pressures building around them. In many cases, they remained educated, politically experienced, and deeply embedded in one of the most sophisticated administrative systems the ancient world had ever produced. And yet, the late Roman elite increasingly found itself reacting to structural change more slowly than the evolving environment required. To understand why, we have to look beyond individual intelligence and examine the psychological environment created by long-term success. For generations, Rome's ruling class had operated inside a system that repeatedly demonstrated its resilience. Frontier disturbances had been contained. Internal revolts had been suppressed. Economic fluctuations had been managed well enough to preserve overall continuity. Over time, this pattern of successful crisis absorption shaped the elite's internal model of risk. Threats were rarely interpreted in isolation. They were filtered through centuries of prior survival. This produced a subtle but powerful recalibration of urgency. When reports arrived describing increased pressure along the Rhine or Danube, the default assumption was not immediate systemic danger. It was familiar frontier volatility, the kind Rome had handled many times before. And in the early phases, that assessment was often partially correct. Rome did continue to stabilize many localized disturbances, but the environment was shifting in ways that did not always register emotionally at the center of power. Population strain, fiscal pressure, military overextension, and administrative rigidity were beginning to overlap in new combinations. Each individual stressor remained manageable. Their cumulative interaction was more complex. Large governing classes often struggle with this type of gradual systemic drift. The signals rarely arrive as a single, unmistakable warning. Instead, they appear as a steady background noise of manageable problems, each one individually insufficient to justify radical restructuring. Within the late Roman elite, another reinforcing factor was social insulation. Members of the upper administrative and senatorial classes were often physically and psychologically removed from the harsher frontier realities facing provincial populations. Their daily experience of the empire still included functioning markets, intact urban life, and the ceremonial continuity of imperial governance. This did not make them blind, but it did subtly shape emotional calibration. Systems that continue to function visibly at the center tend to feel more stable than conditions at the periphery might suggest. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Roman leadership was increasingly engaged in reactive management rather than proactive structural adaptation. Military resources were stretched across multiple fronts. Recruitment became more complicated. Fiscal adjustments grew more frequent. Yet for long stretches, the imperial system still held together well enough to reinforce the belief that, while strained, it remained fundamentally durable. This is the critical psychological phase that appears repeatedly in complex historical systems. Not ignorance, not sudden collapse, but a prolonged period in which intelligent actors continue to manage real problems within a framework shaped by earlier centuries of success. Marcus Aurelius himself lived earlier than the final Western collapse, but many of the structural pressures visible in later Roman centuries were already beginning to take form during his era. His repeated personal warnings to remain vigilant, to distrust premature comfort, to avoid assuming that present stability guaranteed future security, are read, in hindsight, almost like an early awareness of the cognitive drift that large, successful systems are especially vulnerable to over time. The late Roman elite did not fail because it saw nothing. It struggled because the pace at which its internal expectations updated did not always match the pace at which the external environment was evolving. And in complex systems, even small timing gaps, when compounded over decades, can quietly narrow the margin for recovery long before the full scale of the danger becomes emotionally undeniable. In the decades leading up to the French Revolution, the Bourbon monarchy did not appear, at least on the surface, to be standing on the edge of immediate collapse. Versailles still glittered with ceremonial precision. The machinery of royal administration continued to function. France remained one of the most populous and culturally influential kingdoms in Europe. From within the courtly world of the late 18th century, the system felt strained at times, but not terminal. And this perception would prove historically decisive, because the crisis that ultimately engulfed the French monarchy did not emerge overnight. It accumulated slowly through fiscal imbalance, structural inequality, and mounting social pressure that developed over generations. By the reign of Louis XVI, the financial architecture of the French state was already under severe strain. Years of costly wars, including support for the American Revolution, had deepened the crown's debt burden. Taxation remained uneven and politically sensitive, with large segments of the privileged estates shielded from the full weight of fiscal reform. Royal ministers were not unaware of the problem. Reform proposals appeared repeatedly within the government. Figures like Turgot and later Necker attempted to signal the seriousness of the fiscal imbalance. But recognition alone does not guarantee timely transformation. The French monarchy faced a structural dilemma that appears frequently in long-established systems. Meaningful reform required confronting entrenched privilege. Confronting entrenched privilege risked political backlash strong enough to destabilize the very authority attempting the reform. For years, the crown attempted partial adjustments, enough to relieve immediate pressure, but not enough to fully rebalance the system. In the short term, this strategy preserved surface stability. Versailles continued its routines. Court life retained its elaborate rhythm. The kingdom did not feel day to day like it was approaching revolutionary rupture. And this is where the psychology of delayed danger becomes especially visible. Many members of the French elite did perceive that financial stress was real, but the monarchy had survived fiscal strain before. Social hierarchy had held for centuries. The administrative state, though imperfect, continued to function. Each year without systemic collapse quietly reinforced the belief that the situation, while serious, remained containable within the existing political framework. Meanwhile, conditions outside the court were evolving. Population growth placed new pressure on food supply. Grain price volatility affected urban populations more sharply. Enlightenment ideas circulated through educated classes, gradually shifting expectations about authority and representation. None of these developments individually guaranteed revolution, but together they formed a slowly tightening web of structural tension. By the time the Estates General was finally convened in 1789, an extraordinary step that signaled the depth of the fiscal crisis, the political atmosphere was already far more volatile than many within the traditional royal framework had fully internalized. The system had not been blind, but it had adapted cautiously, incrementally, and often too slowly to keep pace with the accumulating pressures. What makes the fall of the French monarchy so instructive is not that warning signs were absent. It is that the kingdom experienced a long period in which serious structural problems coexisted with the outward performance of stability. Court ritual continued. Administrative forms remained intact. The symbols of royal authority still projected continuity, and in complex human systems, visible continuity is often emotionally persuasive, even when underlying balances are shifting. When the revolutionary rupture finally came, it felt sudden to many observers inside the old order. In structural terms, however, the pressures had been building for decades. The French case illustrates one of history's most persistent lessons. Systems rarely collapse because their leaders see nothing at all. More often, they struggle because the pace of meaningful adaptation fails to match the speed at which underlying tensions are quietly accumulating beneath a surface that still, for a time, looks convincingly normal. By the final decade of the Soviet Union, the system did not outwardly resemble a structure on the verge of rapid disintegration. The red flag still flew over the Kremlin. The military remained vast. The state security apparatus continued to function. On paper, the USSR was still one of the two superpowers shaping the global order. And yet, beneath that surface of geopolitical weight, the internal margins of the system had been narrowing for years. The late Soviet period offers one of the clearest modern examples of how large, complex systems can maintain the appearance of formidable strength while structural strain quietly accumulates underneath. The Soviet leadership was not unaware of economic inefficiencies. By the 1970s and 1980s, internal reports increasingly acknowledged stagnation in productivity, technological lag relative to Western economies, and growing fiscal pressure from maintaining both domestic commitments and global strategic competition. But awareness alone does not automatically produce rapid systemic adaptation. Like many long-lived political structures, the Soviet system had developed deep institutional habits that favored stability and predictability over rapid structural experimentation. Central planning mechanisms, whilst capable of mobilizing resources on a massive scale, were less agile when confronted with the need for continuous innovation and decentralized adjustment. For long stretches, the system compensated. Energy exports provided hard currency. The military balance with the United States remained broadly intact. Daily life for many Soviet citizens, while often constrained, retained enough routine to feel structurally stable rather than imminently catastrophic. This is the phase in which normalcy bias operates most powerfully, when supermarkets are still open, when salaries still arrive, when the state still projects authority. The psychological threshold for urgent alarm remains surprisingly high, even among well-informed observers. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms such as perestroika and glasnost in the mid-1980s, the leadership clearly understood that the system required significant adjustment. But reform in large, tightly integrated, Political systems carries its own risks. Efforts to increase transparency exposed previously contained dissatisfaction. Economic restructuring introduced short-term disruption before long-term efficiency could stabilize. Political openness altered the informational environment faster than the institutional framework could fully absorb. What followed was not a single catastrophic failure point, but a rapid cascade once accumulated pressures crossed a critical threshold. Republic-level tensions intensified. Economic coordination became more fragile. The central authority, long accustomed to projecting control, found its margin for coordinated response narrowing quickly. To many observers inside the Soviet Union, the speed of the final unraveling in 1991 felt shocking. But from a structural perspective, the underlying stresses had been building for over a decade, arguably longer. The system had not been static. It had been slowly losing adaptive flexibility while still maintaining enough outward capacity to appear globally formidable. The late Soviet case illustrates one of the most modern and unsettling versions of a very old pattern. Complex systems often remain operational, sometimes even impressive, right up until the moment when accumulated rigidity, economic strain, and political pressure begin to interact in ways that exceed the system's ability to recalibrate smoothly. The Soviet Union did not collapse because its leaders believed there were no problems. It struggled because the depth, interaction, and timing of those problems became fully visible only after the margin for low-cost adjustment had already narrowed significantly. And like Rome, Byzantium, and other long-lived powers before it, the most dangerous phase was not the moment of visible crisis. It was the long period beforehand, when the structure still looked from the outside strong enough to endure. By the final decade of the Soviet Union, the system did not outwardly resemble a structure on the verge of rapid disintegration. The red flag still flew over the Kremlin. The military remained vast. The state security apparatus continued to function. On paper, the USSR was still one of the two superpowers shaping the global order. And yet, beneath that surface of geopolitical weight, the internal margins of the system had been narrowing for years. The late Soviet period offers one of the clearest modern examples of how large, complex systems can maintain the appearance of formidable strength while structural strain quietly accumulates underneath. The Soviet leadership was not unaware of economic inefficiencies. By the 1970s and 1980s, internal reports increasingly acknowledged stagnation in productivity, technological lag relative to Western economies, and growing fiscal pressure from maintaining both domestic commitments and global strategic competition. But awareness alone does not automatically produce rapid systemic adaptation. Like many long-lived political structures, the Soviet system had developed deep institutional habits that favored stability and predictability over rapid structural experimentation. Central planning mechanisms, while capable of mobilizing resources on a massive scale, were less agile when confronted with the need for continuous innovation and decentralized adjustment. For long stretches, the system compensated. Energy exports provided hard currency. The military balance with the United States remained broadly intact. Daily life for many Soviet citizens, while often constrained, retained enough routine to feel structurally stable rather than imminently catastrophic. This is the phase in which normalcy bias operates most powerfully, when supermarkets are still open, when salaries still arrive, when the state still projects authority. The psychological threshold for urgent alarm remains surprisingly high, even among well-informed observers. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms such as perestroika and glasnost in the mid-1980s, the leadership clearly understood that the system required significant adjustment. But reform in large, tightly integrated political systems carries its own risks. Efforts to increase transparency exposed previously contained dissatisfaction. Economic restructuring introduced short-term disruption before long-term efficiency could stabilize. Political openness altered the informational environment faster than the institutional framework could fully absorb. What followed was not a single catastrophic failure point, but a rapid cascade once accumulated pressures crossed a critical threshold. Republic-level tensions intensified. Economic coordination became more fragile. The central authority, long accustomed to projecting control, found its margin for coordinated response narrowing quickly. To many observers inside the Soviet Union, the speed of the final unraveling in 1991 felt shocking. But from a structural perspective, the underlying stresses had been building for over a decade, arguably longer. The system had not been static. It had been slowly losing adaptive flexibility while still maintaining enough outward capacity to appear globally formidable. The late Soviet case illustrates one of the most modern and unsettling versions of a very old pattern. Complex systems often remain operational, sometimes even impressive, right up until the moment when accumulated rigidity, economic strain, and political pressure begin to interact in ways that exceed the system's ability to recalibrate smoothly. The Soviet Union did not collapse because its leaders believed there were no problems. It struggled because the depth, interaction, and timing of those problems became fully visible only after the margin for low-cost adjustment had already narrowed significantly, and like Rome, Byzantium, and other long-lived powers before it, the most dangerous phase was not the moment of visible crisis. It was the long period beforehand, when the structure still looked from the outside strong enough to endure. Among the many psychological patterns that appear again and again in the history of powerful societies, few are as quietly seductive as the illusion of superiority. The belief that one's system, culture, or moment in history occupies a fundamentally safer position than those that failed before it. This illusion rarely begins as arrogance in its crude form. More often, it emerges gradually from long periods of genuine success, when a state expands for generations, when its institutions repeatedly absorb shocks, when its military or economic performance consistently outpaces rivals, a subtle cognitive shift begins to occur. Past survival starts to feel like structural immunity. What was once understood as hard-won resilience slowly transforms in the collective imagination into something closer to permanence. The late Roman elite displayed traces of this mindset. After centuries of frontier dominance, the French monarchy operated within it after generations of Bourbon continuity. Even late Soviet leadership, despite growing internal reports of stagnation, still presided over a superpower whose global reach reinforced the emotional impression of systemic durability. The danger of the superiority illusion is not that it blinds societies completely. In most historical cases, warning signals were visible to at least some observers inside the system. The danger is that superiority reframes how those signals are emotionally processed. Threats that would trigger urgent response in a weaker or more fragile system are interpreted instead as manageable disturbances. Structural strain is categorized as temporary imbalance. External competitors are quietly underestimated. Psychologically, the mechanism is deeply human. The brain uses recent success as a heuristic for future expectation. If the system has repeatedly demonstrated strength, the mind assigns lower probability to near-term failure. This is efficient in stable environments. But in complex geopolitical or economic ecosystems, where conditions evolve, the same mental shortcut can distort risk assessment at precisely the wrong moment. Superiority also interacts powerfully with institutional inertia. The more a system believes in its own exceptional resilience, the higher the internal resistance to disruptive reform tends to become. After all, why risk destabilizing something that appears to be working? Why incur the political and social cost of deep restructuring if the current model has delivered decades or centuries of success? Over time, this logic can create a narrowing adaptation window. Early signals are acknowledged but not prioritized. Partial adjustments are favored over structural overhaul. Confidence remains publicly and often privately intact, even as the external environment continues to evolve. Marcus Aurelius, interestingly, appears to have been unusually cautious about this psychological trap. His repeated reminders about impermanence, about the temporary nature of power, reputation, and even empire itself, read almost like a deliberate philosophical counterweight to the very human temptation towards superiority thinking. He understood something many systems learn only late, that strength observed in one era does not automatically guarantee resilience in the next. The superiority illusion becomes most dangerous not at the peak of confidence but in the long plateau that often follows it, because during that plateau the system still functions well enough to reinforce belief in its durability, even as the external conditions that once supported its dominance begin, slowly and unevenly, to shift. And history suggests that by the time the illusion fully breaks, the adjustment required to restore balance is often far more expensive than it would have been when the first quiet signals began to appear. Closely related to the illusion of superiority is an even more stabilizing and often more dangerous psychological state, the feeling of systemic invulnerability. This is the quiet internal conviction that the structure one lives inside is simply too large, too established, or too historically proven to experience rapid or irreversible failure. Unlike overt arrogance, the sense of system immunity rarely announces itself loudly. It forms gradually, reinforced by decades of continuity, repeated crisis survival, and the visible scale of the institutions involved. When a system has endured for generations, the human mind begins to treat its survival not as an ongoing achievement, but as a built-in feature of reality. In the Roman world, the empire's immense geographic reach and long administrative memory created precisely this kind of psychological cushion. In late Byzantium, the legendary strength of Constantinople's walls fostered a similar emotional buffer. In the late Soviet Union, the sheer magnitude of military and political power projected an image of structural permanence that was difficult, even for insiders to emotionally question. The critical danger of the invulnerability feeling is that it does not require the absence of problems. Systems can acknowledge fiscal strain, military pressure, or political tension, while still maintaining a deep underlying belief that the core structure will ultimately absorb the shock. This belief changes behavior in subtle but consequential ways. Early warning signals trigger monitoring rather than mobilization. Reform proposals generate discussion rather than urgency. Risk assessments become calibrated to past recoveries rather than future uncertainty. Over time, institutional response speed begins to drift out of alignment with environmental change. What makes this psychological state especially persistent is that it is often supported by real historical evidence, at least initially. Many long-lived systems do successfully survive multiple serious crises. Rome did recover repeatedly in earlier centuries. Byzantium had endured devastating shocks before. The Soviet state had navigated enormous internal and external pressures across much of the 20th century. Each successful recovery strengthened the emotional case for continued resilience. But systemic invulnerability is not a fixed property. It is a moving relationship between institutional flexibility and external pressure. The moment flexibility begins to narrow while pressure continues to evolve, the old confidence can quietly become outdated, even while it still feels psychologically persuasive inside the system. Marcus Aurelius, in his private reflections, seems almost preoccupied with resisting this kind of mental drift. His repeated emphasis on impermanence, on the fragility of human arrangements, on the constant possibility of reversal, suggests a ruler consciously trying to keep his internal model of reality aligned with uncertainty rather than comfort. And this may be the deeper lesson embedded across multiple historical cases. The most dangerous phase for complex systems is rarely the moment of obvious weakness. It is the long period during which the structure remains visibly functional, while the internal margin for absorbing future shocks is slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly becoming thinner than the collective psychology of the system is prepared to accept. Closely related to the illusion of superiority is an even more stabilizing and often more dangerous psychological state, the feeling of systemic invulnerability. This is the quiet internal conviction that the structure one lives inside is simply too large, too established, or too historically proven to experience rapid or irreversible failure. Unlike overt arrogance, the sense of system immunity rarely announces itself loudly. It forms gradually, reinforced by decades of continuity, repeated crisis survival, and the visible scale of the institutions involved. When a system has endured for generations, the human mind begins to treat its survival not as an ongoing achievement, but as a built-in feature of reality. In the Roman world, the empire's immense geographic reach and long administrative memory created precisely this kind of psychological cushion. In late Byzantium, the legendary strength of Constantinople's walls fostered a similar emotional buffer. In the late Soviet Union, the sheer magnitude of military and political power projected an image of structural permanence that was difficult, even for insiders to emotionally question. The critical danger of the invulnerability feeling is that it does not require the absence of problems. Systems can acknowledge fiscal strain, military pressure, or political tension, while still maintaining a deep underlying belief that the core structure will ultimately absorb the shock. This belief changes behavior in subtle but consequential ways. Early warning signals trigger monitoring rather than mobilization. Reform proposals generate discussion rather than urgency. Risk assessments become calibrated to past recoveries rather than future uncertainty. Over time, institutional response speed begins to drift out of alignment with environmental change. What makes this psychological state especially persistent is that it is often supported by real historical evidence, at least initially. Many long-lived systems do successfully survive multiple serious crises. Rome did recover repeatedly in earlier centuries. Byzantium had endured devastating shocks before. The Soviet state had navigated enormous internal and external pressures across much of the 20th century. Each successful recovery strengthened the emotional case for continued resilience. But systemic invulnerability is not a fixed property. It is a moving relationship between institutional flexibility and external pressure. The moment flexibility begins to narrow while pressure continues to evolve, the old confidence can quietly become outdated, even while it still feels psychologically persuasive inside the system. Marcus Aurelius, in his private reflections, seems almost preoccupied with resisting this kind of mental drift. His repeated emphasis on impermanence, on the fragility of human arrangements, on the constant possibility of reversal, suggests a ruler consciously trying to keep his internal model of reality aligned with uncertainty rather than comfort. And this may be the deeper lesson embedded across multiple historical cases. The most dangerous phase for complex systems is rarely the moment of obvious weakness. It is the long period during which the structure remains visibly functional, while the internal margin for absorbing future shocks is slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly becoming thinner than the collective psychology of the system is prepared to accept. One of the most persistent and misunderstood dynamics in the history of complex societies is what might be called elite blindness. Not the total absence of information at the top, but the gradual distortion of how reality is perceived within insulated centers of power. Contrary to popular imagination, declining systems are rarely governed by leaders who know nothing. More often, the governing elite receives large amounts of data about emerging pressures. Reports arrive, warnings circulate, advisors raise concerns, and yet the collective response still lags behind the changing environment. To understand why, we have to look at the structural environment in which elites operate. Power, especially when sustained across generations, tends to reorganize the informational landscape around itself. Decision-makers at the center of large systems are often physically, socially, and psychologically buffered from the harsher edge conditions experienced at the periphery. In late Rome, senatorial life in major urban centers still retained many visible markers of continuity, even as frontier volatility increased. In Versailles, court ritual maintained an elaborate performance of order, while fiscal strain deepened outside palace walls. In the late Soviet Union, central planning offices continued to produce formal indicators of stability, even as underlying economic inefficiencies multiplied. This does not mean elites see nothing. It means the signal arrives filtered. Within insulated environments, negative information tends to travel more slowly, more cautiously, and often with layers of bureaucratic softening. Subordinates learn, sometimes unconsciously, to frame reports in ways that do not trigger immediate institutional alarm. Ambiguous threats are categorized as manageable. Short-term stability is emphasized over long-term drift. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful recalibration of perceived risk at the top of the system. Elite blindness is therefore less about ignorance and more about signal distortion combined with emotional buffering. When daily life at the center continues to function, the psychological urgency attached to distant warning signs naturally diminishes. Human beings, regardless of status, rely heavily on their immediate environment to calibrate threat perception. If markets still operate, if administrative routines still hold, if ceremonial order remains intact, the system feels more stable than statistical indicators alone might justify. There is also a powerful career dynamic that reinforces this pattern. Inside hierarchical systems, individuals who deliver reassuring interpretations often face less immediate resistance than those who consistently deliver disruptive warnings. Over time, this can produce subtle selection pressure within advisory networks, not through deliberate suppression necessarily, but through accumulated incentives that favor stability narratives over alarmist ones. Marcus Aurelius appears unusually aware of this human vulnerability. His habit of writing private corrective notes to himself, reminders not to be lulled by appearances, not to assume that present order guarantees future security, suggests a ruler consciously trying to counteract the natural informational drift that accompanies power. But even with disciplined self-monitoring, the structural forces that produce elite blindness are difficult to fully eliminate, because they are not simply failures of attention. They are emergent properties of large, complex systems in which distance from the frontier of stress gradually reshapes how urgency is emotionally experienced. And history shows that by the time the full scale of structural strain becomes unmistakably clear at the center, the system has often already entered a phase where the cost of rapid correction is significantly higher than it would have been when the earliest signals first began to appear. As the Roman Empire matured, one of the very mechanisms that had once given it extraordinary durability began slowly and almost invisibly to change its character. The Roman administrative machine did not suddenly collapse under the weight of incompetence. In many ways, it became more elaborate, more regulated, and more tightly organized over time. But complexity and resilience do not always grow in the same direction. What historians often observe in late-stage systems is not administrative weakness, but administrative hardening, a gradual shift from flexible adaptation toward procedural rigidity. In the earlier centuries of Roman expansion, governance structures had been comparatively responsive. Provincial management allowed for a degree of local variation. Military command structures could adjust to rapidly changing frontier conditions. Fiscal extraction, while often heavy, still retained room for negotiated adjustment depending on regional realities. But as the empire aged and pressures accumulated, the central administration increasingly moved toward standardization and tighter control. Tax systems became more fixed and more difficult to recalibrate quickly. Military recruitment procedures became more formalized at the very moment demographic strain was beginning to reduce the available pool of manpower. Legal and bureaucratic processes expanded in volume and procedural complexity, creating greater predictability but also slower institutional reaction speed. This shift did not occur without reason. From the perspective of imperial administrators, greater regulation often appeared necessary to maintain order across an enormous and diverse territory. Standardization reduced uncertainty. Fixed obligations stabilized revenue expectations. Formal hierarchies improved oversight across distant provinces. In the short term, these measures often worked. The Roman state remained impressively functional well into periods of growing strain. But the long-term side effect of administrative hardening is subtle and historically recurrent. As procedural density increases, the cost of rapid adjustment rises. Systems that once adapted through flexible negotiation begin to rely on established pathways that are slower to modify under pressure. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Rome was facing a strategic environment that required faster and more frequent recalibration along military, fiscal, and demographic lines. Yet the administrative culture of the empire had, by then, become increasingly optimized for stability rather than agility. This is the paradox that appears in many long-lived bureaucratic systems. The structures that provide durability in one era can, under changing conditions, reduce the speed of effective response in the next. Rome's bureaucracy did not fail because it stopped functioning. It continued to collect taxes, issue legal rulings, and coordinate large military operations. The problem was more structural and more subtle. The system became progressively less able to adapt quickly and cheaply to new categories of stress. Marcus Aurelius ruled before the full rigidity of the later imperial administration reached its peak, but the early signs of increasing structural load were already visible in his time. The empire he governed still possessed enormous capacity, but it was beginning to require more effort to maintain equilibrium than it had in earlier centuries, and history suggests that when maintenance costs rise steadily inside complex systems, the most dangerous phase is not immediate breakdown. It is the long plateau during which the machinery still operates, but with diminishing margin for easy adjustment when the external environment inevitably continues to evolve. At the height of Abbasid power, the Caliphal court in Baghdad presided over one of the most sophisticated and culturally vibrant political systems of the medieval world. Trade networks stretched across continents. Scholarly life flourished. Administrative institutions functioned with impressive complexity for their time. From the center, the empire still projected the image of a confident and enduring civilization. But beneath that intellectual and commercial brilliance The structural balance between the imperial center and its vast provincial territories was slowly beginning to shift. Like many expansive empires before and after it, the Abbasid state faced the long-term challenge of governing distance. In its earlier phases, the Caliphal administration maintained relatively strong fiscal and political oversight across key regions. Provincial governors operated within a framework that still visibly linked local authority to Baghdad's central command. Over time, however, several pressures began to accumulate. The geographic scale of the empire made direct administrative control increasingly expensive. Military commanders stationed in distant provinces gained greater operational autonomy. Local dynasties and strongmen emerged, often formally acknowledging Abbasid authority while exercising substantial independent power on the ground. This process did not initially look like open fragmentation. Tribute continued to flow in many regions. The caliph's symbolic legitimacy remained widely recognized. Official correspondence still framed the empire as a unified political order, and this is precisely the phase in which systemic weakening is often hardest to emotionally register, because formal structures remain intact even as effective control begins to diffuse. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Abbasid center was increasingly relying on negotiated authority rather than direct administrative command in several frontier regions. Fiscal flows became less predictable. Military loyalty, in some cases, shifted toward regional power brokers. The famous rise of semi-autonomous dynasties, such as the Tulunids in Egypt or the Samanids in Central Asia, reflected not sudden collapse, but gradual decentralization. From Baghdad's perspective, the imperial framework still functioned. The caliphate retained enormous cultural prestige. Bureaucratic life in the capital continued. Intellectual production remained vibrant, yet the empire's effective capacity to rapidly mobilize unified resources across its full territorial expanse was becoming more constrained. This is one of the most instructive patterns in imperial history. Central authority rarely disappears overnight. It thins, it negotiates, it accommodates, it adjusts incrementally to local realities, often for entirely rational, short-term reasons. But each accommodation, each delegation of real power to provincial actors slightly alters the long-term balance between symbolic unity and operational control. The Abbasid experience illustrates how empires can remain culturally and ceremonially impressive long after their peak capacity for centralized coordination has begun to erode. The system does not feel broken from the inside. It feels stretched, but still functioning. And because it continues to function, the psychological pressure for radical structural correction remains relatively low. By the time the cumulative effects of decentralization become strategically decisive, the process has often been unfolding for generations. What once appeared to be temporary administrative flexibility gradually hardens into semi-permanent diffusion of power. And in large, complex systems, restoring lost central cohesion is almost always more difficult than preserving it would have been earlier in the cycle. One of the most quietly powerful forces that slows response inside large systems is the diffusion of responsibility, the subtle psychological shift that occurs when many capable individuals are present, and each assumes that someone else is already monitoring the danger closely enough. At the individual level, human beings are often capable of decisive action when responsibility is clear and immediate. But as systems grow larger and more layered, accountability begins to spread horizontally and vertically across the complex hierarchies. And with that spread comes a measurable drop in urgency. The mechanism is deeply human. When a threat appears ambiguous rather than immediate, the mind instinctively scans the environment for cues about who is expected to act. If multiple authorities exist, military, administrative, financial, political. The perceived burden on any single actor decreases. Concern becomes shared. And shared concern, paradoxically, often weakens early response. History offers repeated examples of this pattern inside mature bureaucratic systems. In the later Roman Empire, frontier pressure reports moved through multiple layers of command before triggering large-scale mobilization. In the late French monarchy, fiscal warnings circulated through advisory networks for years, while decisive structural reform remained politically delayed. In the Soviet system, economic inefficiencies were widely documented across planning bodies long before they translated into rapid systemic adjustment. In each case, information was present, awareness existed, but the distribution of responsibility across complex institutional networks created a form of psychological buffering. Each actor, operating rationally within their defined role, saw part of the picture, but not always enough personal urgency to trigger disruptive action early. What makes diffusion of responsibility especially dangerous in large civilizations is its interaction with normalcy bias and institutional confidence. When the system still appears broadly functional, the perceived cost of immediate intervention feels high, while the perceived cost of waiting feels low. And waiting, in bureaucratic environments, is often the path of least resistance. There is also a reputational dimension that reinforces delay. Early alarm carries risk. Acting too aggressively in response to a threat that later proves manageable can damage careers and political standing. Acting cautiously and being proven right later, by contrast, is often institutionally safer. Over time, this creates subtle but powerful incentives toward incrementalism rather than preemptive structural change. Marcus Aurelius seems to have understood, at least intuitively, how easily responsibility can diffuse in complex systems. His repeated emphasis on personal duty, on doing what is required without waiting for external validation, reads almost like a stoic countermeasure against the natural human tendency to assume that someone else will move first. But even strong individual discipline struggles against systemic diffusion once institutions reach sufficient scale, because diffusion of responsibility is not primarily a moral failure. It is an emergent property of complex organizational design, and when it combines with slow-moving structural pressure, it can quietly delay collective response just long enough for manageable problems to grow into far more expensive crises than they initially appeared to be. One of the most quietly powerful forces that slows response inside large systems is the diffusion of responsibility, the subtle psychological shift that occurs when many capable individuals are present, and each assumes that someone else is already monitoring the danger closely enough. At the individual level, human beings are often capable of decisive action when responsibility is clear and immediate. But as systems grow larger and more layered, accountability begins to spread horizontally and vertically across the complex hierarchies. And with that spread comes a measurable drop in urgency. The mechanism is deeply human. When a threat appears ambiguous rather than immediate, the mind instinctively scans the environment for cues about who is expected to act. If multiple authorities exist, military, administrative, financial, political, the perceived burden on any single actor decreases. Concern becomes shared, and shared concern, paradoxically, often weakens early response. History offers repeated examples of this pattern inside mature bureaucratic systems. In the later Roman Empire, frontier pressure reports moved through multiple layers of command before triggering large-scale mobilization. In the late French monarchy, fiscal warnings circulated through advisory networks for years, while decisive structural reform remained politically delayed. In the Soviet system, economic inefficiencies were widely documented across planning bodies long before they translated into rapid systemic adjustment. In each case, information was present, awareness existed, but the distribution of responsibility across complex institutional networks created a form of psychological buffering. Each actor, operating rationally within their defined role, saw part of the picture, but not always enough personal urgency to trigger disruptive action early. What makes diffusion of responsibility especially dangerous in large civilizations is its interaction with normalcy bias and institutional confidence. When the system still appears broadly functional, the perceived cost of immediate intervention feels high, while the perceived cost of waiting feels low. And waiting, in bureaucratic environments, is often the path of least resistance. There is also a reputational dimension that reinforces delay. Early alarm carries risk. Acting too aggressively in response to a threat that later proves manageable can damage careers and political standing. Acting cautiously and being proven right later, by contrast, is often institutionally safer. Over time, this creates subtle but powerful incentives toward incrementalism rather than preemptive structural change. Marcus Aurelius seems to have understood, at least intuitively, how easily responsibility can diffuse in complex systems. His repeated emphasis on personal duty, on doing what is required without waiting for external validation, reads almost like a stoic countermeasure against the natural human tendency to assume that someone else will move first. But even strong individual discipline struggles against systemic diffusion once institutions reach sufficient scale, because diffusion of responsibility is not primarily a moral failure. It is an emergent property of complex organizational design, and when it combines with slow-moving structural pressure, it can quietly delay collective response just long enough for manageable problems to grow into far more expensive crises than they initially appeared to be. By the later centuries of the Roman Republic and into the imperial transition, one of the most revealing patterns inside the political system was not the absence of intelligence within the Senate, but the growing difficulty of converting awareness into timely, coordinated action. The Roman Senate remained, in many respects, one of the most experienced governing bodies of the ancient world. Its members were highly educated in law, military affairs, and statecraft. They debated extensively. They received reports from across the Mediterranean. Information, for the most part, was not the missing ingredient. What increasingly emerged instead was a form of institutional passivity, a slow, procedural hesitation that became more visible as the scale and complexity of Roman challenges expanded. Part of this dynamic was structural. The Senate was designed as a deliberative body, optimized for consensus building among elite factions. In earlier phases of Roman expansion, this model often worked remarkably well. Threats were more localized. Decision windows were wider. The Republic's political culture rewarded negotiation, coalition formation, and incremental adjustment. But as Rome's territorial reach expanded and the speed of external events increased, the same deliberative structure began to show strain. Urgent military and fiscal challenges sometimes required faster, more unified responses than the senatorial process was naturally built to produce. At the same time, internal political competition among elite families complicated the formation of decisive consensus. Senators were not only evaluating external threats, they were also calculating domestic political positioning, reputational risk, and factional advantage. This created subtle friction inside the decision-making environment. Even when many members recognized that conditions were shifting, whether along volatile frontiers or inside the Republic's increasingly strained political order, the path from recognition to unified action often proved slower than the evolving environment ideally allowed. Another reinforcing factor was the long memory of Roman resilience. For centuries, the Republic had absorbed serious shocks and recovered. This historical experience shaped expectations inside the Senate. Many disturbances still fell within the category of problems Rome had managed before. As long as the system continued to function visibly, armies still mobilizing, taxes still collected, provincial governance still operating, the psychological pressure for radical institutional change remained relatively contained. This is the phase in which institutional passivity becomes most dangerous, not because leaders see nothing, but because the cost of decisive action appears in the moment, higher than the cost of continued managed delay. Marcus Aurelius ruled centuries after the Republic's transformation into empire, but the broader Roman political culture he inherited still carried elements of this deeply deliberative tradition. His own writings suggest an acute awareness of how easily human institutions drift toward procedural comfort when immediate catastrophe is not yet visible. The Senate did not fail Rome through simple negligence. Its hesitation emerged from the very structural features that had once made Roman governance durable: deliberation, consensus building, and political caution. But history repeatedly shows that when external pressures begin to accelerate, systems optimized for stability can struggle to maintain response speed. And in complex political environments, even small delays, when repeated across years and decades, can quietly narrow the window in which relatively low-cost corrective action remains possible. If there is one pattern that history repeats with almost unsettling consistency, it is this: civilizations rarely collapse because they see nothing. They collapse because they see, but not urgently enough. Again and again across Rome, Byzantium, the Abbasid world, the French monarchy, and the late Soviet system, the early signals were present. Reports were written, warnings were voiced, pressures were measured. But between awareness and action lies a narrow psychological gap, and it is inside that gap that the most dangerous comfort lies begin to operate. Human beings are not naturally built for permanent vigilance. We are built to stabilize, to normalize, to preserve emotional equilibrium whenever possible. In stable environments, this trait is efficient, even necessary. But in slowly changing systems, the same mental habit can quietly delay adaptation just long enough for manageable problems to accumulate into structural strain. What makes this pattern so persistent is that it rarely feels irrational from the inside. Each decision to wait has its logic. Each delay has its justification. The system still functions. The markets still move. The institutions still operate. And so the emotional pressure to act decisively remains just below the threshold of urgency, until sometimes very suddenly it doesn't. Marcus Aurelius seemed to sense this human vulnerability more clearly than most rulers of his time. His private reflections return again and again to the same quiet warning: do not assume stability will last simply because it has lasted so far. Do not confuse present calm with structural security. Do not let comfort rewrite your perception of risk. He understood something that many complex systems only recognize late. The most dangerous moment is not when crisis is obvious. It is when the structure still looks strong enough to delay uncomfortable change. Because by the time pressure becomes emotionally undeniable, the cost of adaptation is almost always higher than it would have been earlier. The window does not usually slam shut all at once. It narrows gradually, then quickly, then all at once. And perhaps that is why the study of these historical patterns still matters. Not because history repeats mechanically, it does not, but because the human cognitive architecture operating inside complex systems has changed far less than our technologies, borders, or institutions. The same comfort narratives still appear. The same delays still feel reasonable in the moment. The same quiet assumption that there is still time continues to echo across centuries. If this exploration has done anything, it is to illuminate that thin and often invisible space between knowing and acting. Because in the end, the most consequential turning points in history rarely announce themselves with dramatic certainty. They emerge quietly, inside systems that still appear functional, inside societies that still feel stable, inside moments when most people believe the margin for adjustment is still comfortably wide. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden psychological patterns behind empires, power, and human behavior, consider subscribing to The Enigmatic Veil, because history is not only the story of what collapsed. Sometimes it is the story of how long people believed nothing would. Every empire in history was built on obedience. Armies marched because soldiers followed orders. Bureaucracies functioned because officials respected hierarchy. Laws carried weight because citizens, most of the time, chose compliance over resistance. Without obedience, large human systems simply do not hold together. For most of recorded history, discipline was not seen as dangerous. It was seen as necessary, even virtuous. The Roman legionary who held formation under pressure was praised. The imperial official who carried out policy without hesitation was promoted. The citizen who respected the established order was considered a stabilizing force inside an otherwise unpredictable world. And for long stretches of time, this logic worked remarkably well. Obedience created coordination. Coordination created scale. And scale allowed empires to expand further than any collection of purely independent actors ever could. But buried inside this success was a quieter and far more complicated question, one that rarely becomes visible until systems grow very large and very confident in their own stability. Because the same psychological mechanism that builds order can, under certain conditions, begin to erode the system it once helped sustain. History shows that obedience becomes most dangerous not when it is weak, but when it becomes automatic. When following instructions no longer requires reflection. When hierarchy begins to override judgment. When individuals inside the system gradually stop asking whether the command structure itself is still aligned with reality. This transition does not happen suddenly. It unfolds slowly, often across generations of institutional success. In early phases of expansion, obedience and survival tend to move in the same direction. The system rewards discipline because the environment still favors coordinated strength. But as complexity increases, as bureaucracies thicken, as political structures harden, as incentives begin to favor procedural loyalty over adaptive thinking, the balance can begin to shift. And this is where the historical pattern becomes deeply unsettling, because many of the systems that later struggled most severely were not suffering from too little order. They were saturated with it. The Roman machine did not weaken because its soldiers suddenly refused to follow commands. In many periods, they followed them extremely well. Late imperial bureaucracies did not fail because officials stopped respecting hierarchy. In many cases, they respected it more rigidly than ever. Even in modern institutional environments, some of the most consequential failures have occurred not in moments of chaos, but in moments of highly organized compliance. What begins as discipline can, under pressure, drift towards something more passive, a form of behavioral momentum that keeps the machinery moving even when the environment around it is changing faster than the system's internal assumptions. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps more than most rulers of his era, seemed to sense this tension. His writings repeatedly return to the same quiet warning, that external order is never a substitute for internal judgment, that following the structure is not the same thing as understanding the situation, that a well-organized system can still move very efficiently in the wrong direction if too many people inside it stop questioning at the right moments. In this exploration, we are going to examine the historical turning points where obedience, once the backbone of stability, began to transform into a hidden vulnerability, not because obedience is inherently destructive, but because under certain conditions, the line between discipline and dangerous passivity becomes far thinner than most systems are psychologically prepared to recognize. Before we can understand when obedience becomes dangerous, we have to confront a more uncomfortable truth. Large human societies cannot function without a significant degree of voluntary compliance. At its core, obedience is not merely a tool of authority. It is a coordination mechanism. It allows thousands, sometimes millions of individuals to act in patterns that would otherwise collapse into fragmentation and constant friction. In small groups, trust and direct negotiation can often maintain order. But as systems scale, as cities expand, as armies mobilize, as bureaucracies multiply, the cost of constant individual negotiation becomes unsustainable. Obedience in this context becomes an efficiency solution. The Roman legions demonstrated this principle with remarkable clarity. Their battlefield success did not depend solely on courage or superior weapons. It depended on disciplined formation, the ability of thousands of soldiers to move, hold, and respond as a single coordinated body under extreme pressure. Without obedience to command structure, that level of synchronized action would have been nearly impossible to maintain in the chaos of ancient warfare. The same logic applied to imperial administration. Vast territorial systems like Rome, Han China, or the Ottoman state required layers of officials who would reliably implement policy across enormous distances. If every directive had to be renegotiated at each administrative level, the speed of governance would collapse. Predictability, one of the most valuable assets in large systems, depends heavily on the expectation that most actors will, most of the time, follow established rules and hierarchies. There is also a psychological dimension that makes obedience socially stabilizing. Human beings operate more efficiently when behavioral expectations are clear. When individuals broadly understand the boundaries of authority, coordination costs drop. Markets function more smoothly. Legal systems become more predictable. Military command structures maintain cohesion under stress. In this sense, obedience has historically been one of the quiet foundations of large-scale human cooperation. Marcus Aurelius himself, despite his deep philosophical independence, did not reject obedience as a concept. Stoic thought placed significant emphasis on fulfilling one's role within the larger structure of the world, performing one's duty with discipline and restraint. What concerned him was not obedience itself, but unexamined obedience, the point at which following the system replaces thinking about the system, because obedience is most beneficial when it operates alongside judgment, when individuals retain the capacity to recognize when conditions have changed, when hierarchy remains responsive to reality rather than insulated from it. History suggests that the healthiest large systems are not those that eliminate obedience, but those that maintain a careful balance between discipline and adaptive awareness. Too little obedience produces fragmentation and instability, but too much automatic compliance, especially in rapidly changing environments, can slow correction at precisely the moment when flexibility becomes most critical. And it is in that narrow and often difficult to see space between necessary order and dangerous overcompliance that some of history's most consequential turning points have quietly taken shape. At first glance, discipline and blind obedience can look almost identical from the outside. Both produce order, both create coordinated behavior, Both allow large systems to function without constant friction. But beneath the surface, the psychological architecture of these two states is fundamentally different. And history shows that confusing them can carry very expensive consequences. Discipline is an active state. It requires awareness, internal regulation, and the capacity to align one's actions with both structure and reality at the same time. A disciplined soldier holds formation not because he has stopped thinking, but because he understands the tactical logic of cohesion under pressure. A disciplined official follows procedure while still monitoring whether the procedure continues to serve the system's broader stability. In its healthiest form, discipline is not passive submission. It is controlled cooperation guided by judgment. Blind obedience, by contrast, is a passive state. It emerges when the act of following replaces the act of evaluating. The individual no longer needs to assess whether conditions have changed. The presence of authority becomes sufficient justification for compliance. This shift is often gradual and psychologically comfortable. Thinking is metabolically expensive. Continuous evaluation creates cognitive strain. Over time, especially in highly structured environments, human beings tend to conserve effort by outsourcing judgment upward in the hierarchy. Most of the time in stable systems, this works well enough to maintain efficiency. But when environments begin to change rapidly, the difference between disciplined systems and blindly obedient systems becomes critically important. Disciplined structures retain adaptive capacity. Individuals inside them still register anomalies. They still notice when reality begins to diverge from established assumptions. Blindly obedient structures, however, often continue executing established patterns long after the environment has shifted. From the outside, both systems may appear equally orderly, at least initially. Internally, their flexibility is dramatically different. The Roman military at its peak demonstrated disciplined cohesion combined with tactical adaptability. Later, bureaucratic environments in multiple empires, by contrast, sometimes drifted toward procedural rigidity where compliance was rewarded more consistently than situational awareness. Marcus Aurelius's Stoic framework reflects a deep sensitivity to this distinction. His repeated emphasis on self-governance, on maintaining clarity of judgment, even while fulfilling one's role within the larger order, suggests that he understood obedience without awareness carries long-term risk. The Stoic ideal was never mindless compliance. It was conscious alignment with duty, while preserving the inner capacity to see reality clearly. This is why the line between discipline and blind obedience is so historically important. Both create stability in the short term, but only one preserves the system's ability to adjust when conditions inevitably change. And history suggests that the most dangerous phase in the life of complex institutions often begins at the moment when outward order remains impressive, but the internal habit of independent judgment has quietly begun to thin. If we strip away the mythology that often surrounds great empires, one structural reality becomes difficult to avoid. No large-scale political order in history has ever been built without a substantial foundation of obedience. Coordination at imperial scale requires predictability. Predictability requires that most individuals, most of the time, follow established commands, laws, and institutional expectations without constant renegotiation. Without this baseline compliance, large systems fragment quickly under their own complexity. The Roman Empire did not expand across 3 continents through individual improvisation alone. Its legions functioned because soldiers held formation under pressure, even when instinct might have pushed them to break. Its administrative networks operated because provincial officials implemented directives issued hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Its legal authority carried weight because the majority of subjects accepted, however reluctantly, The legitimacy of imperial order. The same pattern appears across civilizations. Imperial China relied on layers of scholar officials who executed policy with disciplined regularity. The Ottoman state maintained cohesion across vast territories through highly structured military and bureaucratic obedience. Even modern nation-states depend on millions of routine acts of compliance each day. Tax systems, legal enforcement, military command, civil administration. In this sense, obedience is not merely a political preference. It is a scaling mechanism for human organization. Small groups can function through direct trust and constant negotiation. Large systems cannot. They require a predictable behavioral baseline that allows coordination to occur faster than individual deliberation would permit. Marcus Aurelius, despite his philosophical caution toward unthinking conformity, understood this structural necessity. His Stoic worldview did not reject hierarchy or duty. On the contrary, it emphasized the importance of fulfilling one's role within the larger order of the world. What concerned him, and what history repeatedly warns about, was not obedience itself, but the gradual transformation of necessary discipline into automatic compliance. Because while empires are rarely built without obedience, they can become dangerously rigid when obedience begins to replace adaptive judgment. The strength that once allowed the system to coordinate efficiently can, under changing conditions, begin to slow the very flexibility required for long-term survival. And this is where the historical tension emerges. The same behavioral force that makes large-scale order possible can, if left completely unchecked, quietly narrow the system's capacity to recognize when the environment has begun to change. Few civilizations in history developed a bureaucratic obedience system as sophisticated or as enduring as Imperial China. For centuries, the Chinese state cultivated an administrative culture built on hierarchy, ritual precision, and deep respect for ordered authority. At its best, this structure produced remarkable continuity. Dynasties rose and fell, but the bureaucratic skeleton of governance repeatedly reconstituted itself with impressive resilience. The imperial examination system played a central role in this stability. Scholar officials were selected not primarily for military loyalty or hereditary privilege, but for mastery of classical texts, administrative discipline, and demonstrated capacity to operate within a highly structured moral and political framework. In theory, this created one of the most intellectually sophisticated governing classes in the pre-modern world, and for long periods, it worked extraordinarily well. Imperial China maintained territorial cohesion across vast distances. Tax systems functioned with notable regularity. Administrative communication flowed through carefully maintained channels that allowed the center to project authority deep into the provinces. But embedded inside this success was a quieter long-term trade-off that becomes visible when we examine the system through a psychological lens. Highly refined bureaucratic cultures often reward procedural correctness more consistently than adaptive risk-taking. Over generations, this incentive structure can subtly recalibrate elite behavior. Officials learn, often unconsciously, that career stability depends less on creative deviation and more on precise conformity to established administrative norms. This does not eliminate intelligence within the system. Imperial China produced some of the most sophisticated political thinkers in pre-modern history, but it can gradually shape how that intelligence is expressed under conditions of uncertainty. When environments remain relatively stable, bureaucratic obedience provides enormous advantages. Policy implementation is consistent. Institutional memory remains strong. Large populations can be governed with predictable administrative rhythm. However, when external or internal conditions begin to shift more rapidly, Highly formalized systems sometimes encounter a different kind of strain. The very habits that once produced stability, caution, procedural fidelity, respect for established hierarchy, can slow the speed at which uncomfortable structural adjustments are fully embraced. Chinese history offers several moments where reform-minded officials recognized emerging challenges but faced significant resistance from within the existing bureaucratic culture. Not necessarily because individuals lacked awareness, but because the institutional environment had been optimized over centuries to minimize disruptive deviation. Marcus Aurelius, operating in a very different imperial context, nevertheless seems to have sensed a similar human tendency. His repeated emphasis on maintaining inner clarity rather than relying solely on external structure reflects an understanding that systems, no matter how well designed, can drift toward overconfidence in procedural order. The lesson of Chinese bureaucratic obedience is not that discipline is inherently dangerous. On the contrary, it was one of the key pillars of imperial durability. The lesson is more subtle and more historically recurring. When obedience becomes too tightly coupled with career survival, and when procedural conformity consistently outweighs adaptive initiative, large systems can continue to function impressively on the surface. Even as their responsiveness to changing conditions begins, very gradually, to narrow beneath that outward stability. Discipline becomes dangerous at a very specific moment in the life of complex systems. Not when order is weak, but when order becomes so efficient that it begins to operate faster than the system's ability to question itself. In the early phases of state formation, discipline is overwhelmingly beneficial. It reduces chaos, it synchronizes action, it allows armies to hold under pressure and administrations to function across vast distances. Under these conditions, obedience and survival tend to move in the same direction. The environment rewards coordination, and disciplined systems outperform fragmented ones. But history shows that as systems mature, the strategic environment rarely remains static. External pressures evolve, economic patterns shift, military technologies change, social expectations slowly transform. And it is precisely at this point, when the environment begins to move but the internal culture of obedience remains optimized for stability, that discipline can begin to drift toward danger. The transition is rarely visible in real time. From the inside, the system still appears highly functional. Orders are executed efficiently, procedures are followed precisely, hierarchies remain intact. In fact, the system often looks stronger than ever on the surface. What changes is more subtle, the ratio between compliance and independent judgment. In highly disciplined but still adaptive systems, individuals continue to register anomalies. They notice when conditions diverge from established assumptions. They adjust at the margins even while maintaining overall order. But when institutional incentives begin to reward procedural loyalty more consistently than situational awareness, a quiet shift occurs. People stop asking whether the instruction still fits the environment. They focus instead on whether the instruction is being executed correctly. At that point, discipline has not disappeared. It has hardened. And hardened systems, while extremely stable in familiar conditions, tend to react more slowly when unfamiliar stress begins to accumulate. The Roman military machine offers an early illustration of this pattern. In its most effective phases, legionary discipline was paired with remarkable tactical flexibility. Commanders adapted formations, adjusted strategy, and responded dynamically to changing battlefield conditions. But in later bureaucratic environments across multiple empires, procedural rigidity sometimes began to outpace adaptive thinking. The machinery still moved, often impressively, but its sensitivity to environmental change narrowed. Marcus Aurelius appears to have understood at least philosophically, how thin this line could become. His repeated emphasis on self-examination and mental vigilance suggests a ruler aware that external order can create internal complacency if left completely unexamined. For the Stoics, true discipline was never meant to eliminate judgment. It was meant to stabilize it. This is the critical threshold history keeps returning to. Discipline becomes dangerous the moment it stops being consciously maintained and begins to run on psychological autopilot. Because once obedience becomes automatic, systems can continue executing established patterns long after the environment that once justified those patterns has quietly begun to change. And from the inside, that moment rarely feels like the beginning of danger. It feels like peak efficiency. Blind orders become historically dangerous not merely because they exist, but because of the environment in which they are issued and obeyed. In highly structured systems, the chain of command is designed to reduce hesitation under pressure. Soldiers are trained to move when instructed. Officials are conditioned to implement policy with procedural precision. In stable environments, this produces extraordinary efficiency, but the same mechanism becomes far more volatile when political incentives begin to distort the command structure itself. The Roman world offers an early and revealing illustration. During the Republic's expansion phase, military obedience largely served strategic coordination. Commanders in the field operated within a political culture that, while competitive, still maintained relatively strong institutional norms. But as the Republic moved toward its later crisis period, the alignment between military obedience and state stability began to shift. Ambitious generals increasingly understood that disciplined troops could be mobilized not only for external defense, but for internal political leverage. The loyalty of legions, once primarily tied to the Roman state, began in certain periods to drift toward individual commanders whose personal authority and reward systems directly shaped the soldiers' incentives. This was not an immediate collapse of discipline. In fact, the Roman legions remained extraordinarily disciplined in their execution. Orders were followed, formations held, campaigns were conducted with impressive efficiency. The danger emerged from the growing gap between procedural obedience and the political objectives driving the commands. When obedience is decoupled from institutional stability and increasingly tied to factional or personal power struggles, the same disciplined machinery that once protected the system can begin to amplify internal volatility. Soldiers trained not to question commands become extremely effective instruments in the hands of whoever successfully secures their loyalty. From the perspective of the individual legionary, the behavior has not changed. The order is still being followed. The discipline is still being maintained, but the systemic impact of that obedience can be radically different depending on the political environment surrounding it. This pattern does not belong only to Rome. Across multiple historical settings, highly obedient administrative or military bodies have functioned efficiently even as the strategic direction guiding them became increasingly misaligned with long-term system stability. The mechanism is structurally simple but psychologically powerful. When the cost of questioning rises, socially, professionally, or legally, individuals inside hierarchical systems gradually shift toward narrower interpretations of duty. Responsibility becomes procedural rather than evaluative. The question subtly changes from, "Is this direction still sound?" to, "Is this my order to execute?" Marcus Aurelius's private reflections suggest a ruler deeply aware of this human vulnerability. His repeated insistence on maintaining inner judgment, even while fulfilling one's external role, reads almost like a philosophical safeguard against the very real danger that highly efficient obedience can, under the wrong political conditions, become a force multiplier for instability rather than order. Because history shows that the most dangerous systems are not always those where people refuse to follow commands. Sometimes they are the ones where commands are followed with perfect precision, long after the strategic wisdom behind them has quietly begun to erode. Excessive obedience rarely looks dangerous at first. On the contrary, highly compliant systems often appear impressively orderly, predictable, and efficient on the surface. Procedures are followed precisely. Hierarchies function smoothly. Deviations are minimized. In stable environments, these traits can produce remarkable administrative consistency. But beneath that surface stability, an important trade-off begins to emerge, one that becomes visible only over longer time horizons. Innovation requires friction. It requires individuals who are willing, at least occasionally, to question whether existing patterns still match changing reality. Highly obedient cultures, however, tend to systematically reduce that friction. Over time, they recalibrate incentives in subtle but powerful ways. Career advancement becomes tied more closely to procedural reliability than to adaptive risk-taking. Institutional trust becomes linked to conformity rather than creative deviation, and gradually, without any single dramatic policy decision, the system's tolerance for experimentation begins to narrow. Imperial China's mature bureaucratic culture offers one of the clearest historical illustrations of this dynamic. The examination system produced extraordinarily disciplined scholar officials capable of administering vast territories with impressive regularity. But the same cultural emphasis on classical mastery and procedural correctness sometimes made disruptive innovation institutionally uncomfortable. This did not mean the civilization lacked intelligence or creativity. Chinese scientific and technological achievements were profound across many centuries. The shift was more subtle. In periods of relative stability, the administrative environment increasingly rewarded those who preserved established order more reliably than those who proposed structural deviation. When environments remain broadly predictable, this bias toward stability can be highly adaptive. Systems run smoothly. Policy implementation remains consistent. Social order holds. But when external conditions begin to evolve more rapidly through technological change, geopolitical competition, or internal demographic pressure, the same stability-optimized culture can encounter growing difficulty adjusting its internal rhythm quickly enough. Excessive obedience does not eliminate innovation outright. What it often does is raise the psychological and institutional cost of being early. Reformers face higher reputational risk. Experimental proposals encounter thicker procedural resistance. Over time, adaptive energy inside the system becomes more cautious, more incremental, and more constrained by the very structures that once provided durability. Marcus Aurelius, though operating in a different imperial tradition, appears to have understood the human tendency toward over-reliance on established patterns. His Stoic emphasis on continuous self-examination reflects an awareness that systems, like individuals, drift toward comfort when left unchallenged. The deeper historical lesson is not that obedience is inherently harmful. Large-scale order depends on a significant degree of disciplined compliance. The danger emerges at the margin, at the point where preserving procedural harmony becomes more consistently rewarded than accurately responding to environmental change. Because when innovation is quietly suffocated by excessive conformity, systems often continue to function convincingly for long periods, right up until the moment when the outside world has moved further ahead than the internal culture of obedience is prepared to acknowledge.